So, I know a lot of you were expecting an episode of Battle Analysis today, and don't worry, the show will come back to its normal schedule next week, but this week's episode of Ahsoka left a lot to talk about, and I kind of want to touch on some of those things, particularly pertaining to the Clone Wars. Now, if you haven't seen this week's episode of Ahsoka, which was the 5th episode of the show, and would like to remain spoiler-free, because this video will include some spoilers, I'll leave a link up here to a video on the differences between Phase 1 and Phase 2 Clone Trooper armor and what that transition was like within the Clone Army. So, spoiler warning, you've been warned. So in this week's episode of Ahsoka, we actually got a taste of the Clone Wars in live action, which we haven't had since, 2005. So I'd like to take this opportunity to actually discuss these battles, but in particular, the one battle that we don't really have the ability to identify. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So I want to get ahead of myself here and maybe just throw out there that by the end of this video, I won't have an answer to what this battle is. I will talk a little bit about some of the hints that we have, and we can nail down where in the war this is, but we don't know what planet it's on. We'll take some guesses and we'll discuss that, but there's not a concrete answer in this video. So, getting into that, this battle is displayed during a series of flashback sequences seen from Ahsoka's perspective, showing her sort of being transported in almost a dreamlike state back to the early days of the Clone Wars. We see two battles depicted in this sequence. One unidentified battle near the beginning of the war, and then the Siege of Mandalore during the very last days of the conflict. Now, the stuff during the Siege of Mandalore is pretty self-explanatory. We all know the Siege of Mandalore, we know where it took place, when it took place, and we know that it happened immediately before the execution of Order 66 and the end of the war. It happened basically concurrently to the stuff that occurred in Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. That being during the Outer Rim sieges, the battles of Megiddo, Felucia, Coruscant, stuff like that. So we know a ton about that one, and there really isn't a lot of new information about this battle provided in this sequence. It's just really cool to see it in live action. But the other battle we see is a bit more of a mystery. It's described as one of their first missions. In fact, I believe the episode they say it's their first mission together, them being Anakin and Ahsoka. But that can't be right. The first mission Anakin and Ahsoka went on together would have been the Battle of Christophsis, or maybe you could say the Battle of Teth, both of which were not like what is depicted in the show. In the Battle of Christophsis, we see the Republic facing off against a Separatist assault on the world of Christophsis in the Separatist offensives at the opening stages of the war. The fighting for this battle mainly took place on the open and beautiful city streets of the capital of Christophsis, which is not what we see on screen here. While there was heavy Republic armor during the Battle of Christophsis, it wasn't used quite the same way we see on screen in Ahsoka, and it doesn't really line up. That leaves us with the Battle of Teth, but if we look at the Battle of Teth, we also don't see very many similarities. The Battle of Teth was very interesting. It involved the Separatists occupying a monastery on top of what is essentially a plateau with straight cliff faces, and the Republic assaulting vertically up the side of the cliff. This meant that while we did see things like ATTEs, which are the big tip-off here, and clone troopers fighting in Phase 1 armor, it was almost all rotated 90 degrees as they made their way up this cliff face. By the time Republic forces had reached the monastery, much of the fighting had been concluded. That leads me to believe that this is a third battle that occurred right around the same time in the war. Likely very, very early on in the conflict, within the first 2 to 3 months of the war's beginning. That being said, since we do see Anakin and Ahsoka's first meeting, and their first mission together being the Battle of Christophsis, it's safe to assume that when it's said that this is their first mission together, it's more of an abstract concept than a direct dictation that this is the first mission they went on together. Basically saying, this is from very early in our relationship, maybe one of the first missions they went on together. The battle depicted shows a cloudy and smoggy battlefield, which, to be fair, seems to be the case for the depiction of the Siege of Mandalore as well, but when we see the Siege of Mandalore in the Clone Wars, it's not quite as hazy, so perhaps it's a little bit of exaggeration for effect and caused by the Force vision that all of this really is. But we see in this battlefield, it seems to be a very flat, open terrain in which large Republic armored units, most notably ATTEs, quite a few ATTEs, are being used to carry out repetitive frontal assaults against Separatist positions, a tactic used a lot by the Republic throughout the war, but primarily during the opening months, so it lines up well with that hypothesis. But I think all things considered, this unidentified battle from the early days of the Clone Wars is never supposed to be identified. It's likely supposed to just represent the casualties of the war, the horrors of the early days of the conflict, as seen through the perspective of a child who had never seen combat before, and had been thrust into the position of not just fighting a war, but commanding soldiers while they fought in an active conflict. It plays on the character's trauma and the sort of damage that the Clone Wars did to Ahsoka herself. I want to throw out there, too, just my own personal reaction to this. When I first saw this on screen, is I thought it might be the Battle of Jabim, which is one of the Legends battles referenced a lot in old Legends material, as one of the bloodiest battles of not just the early days of the war, but of the war in its entirety. But the Battle of Jabim is technically Legends, so who knows? But all in all, it's just really cool to get to see the Clone Wars on screen in live action, see Rex on screen in live action, see the armor that we saw in the animated show portrayed in a more realistic fashion. And it really does help draw attention to the chaos and sort of unique aesthetics as well of this period in galactic history. If you'd like to learn more about this specific period in galactic history, I'll leave a link up here to my battle analysis on what was the first mission Anakin and Ahsoka went on together, the Battle of Christophsis. And I'd like you to let me know down in the comments what battle you think this scene is depicting. Is there a specific battle from Legends or Canon that I might have missed that this could be intending to depict? Or do you think this really is just generalizing a battle from the early days of the war? And if you have anything else you'd like to see me cover in Star Wars, you can let me know down below in the comments. Last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.